with a major test of presidential power as the Supreme Court is set to consider just how much authority President Trump has over independent federal agencies.
Right now, justices are hearing arguments in the closely watched case of a former Trump-appointed member of the Federal Trade Commission who was fired by President Trump after he said she didn't align with his agenda. I want to bring in CNN senior legal analyst Elie Honig right now. He's been listening closely to all these arguments. What have you heard so far, Elie?
Well, Wolf, it's going very well for the Trump administration so far. So the arguments are still ongoing, but the battle lines here have been drawn very clearly. The court's 6 conservative justices clearly seem to agree with the Trump administration's position that the president is the head of the executive branch and therefore can fire agency heads for any reason he wants. However, the 3 liberal justices strongly oppose that. They've been essentially arguing through their questions that Congress passed a law saying the president can only fire those agency heads for good cause, for poor performance on the job or other bad conduct. However, the numbers are the numbers here, and it seems the conservatives are making a strong case here that the president should have the power, notwithstanding a long-standing precedent that the president should have the power to choose to remove those agency heads from the FTC and other similar agencies, really for any reason he wants.
What will a decision, Elie, in this case say about the scope of the executive power?
Yeah, well, so there is a fundamental recalibration of executive power happening in this country right now. So the argument that the Trump administration's lawyer, the Solicitor General John Sauer, is making is essentially something that's been called for a long time the unitary executive theory, meaning the president is the duly elected head of the executive branch and he can do whatever he pleases within the executive branch, and it violates separation of powers for Congress to try to come in and limit that. Now, for a long time, Wolf, for decades, that's been a theory, but it hasn't really caught hold. Now, however, that you have the Trump administration in power, that you have 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court, this unitary executive theory is really reaching its pinnacle, and it is becoming the law of the land. And again, the liberals were pushing back. At one point, Justice Sotomayor said, don't we risk making the president a king? Essentially, she said, even kings cannot remove whoever they want for whatever reason they want. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and Justice Kagan voiced similar concerns about giving the president too much power. But the response from John Sauer, essentially, we're not saying the president can do whatever he wants throughout all of government. We are saying the president controls the executive branch and has complete power within that executive branch.
Next month, Elie, the U.S. Supreme Court will consider another case involving the president's firing of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. Is this case the same as that one we've just been talking about?
So good question. This has actually come up in the arguments today. It is clear that whatever the ruling is today with respect to the FTC will impact most of the other 24 or so independent agencies in the executive branch, the National Labor Relations Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and on and on. However, justices from both sides, including Justice Kavanaugh, have made a point of asking the Trump administration's lawyer, but isn't the Fed different? And the Trump administration's lawyer said, yes, it is. So the Fed seems to stand separate and apart from these other agencies. And while the Trump administration seems very likely to win this argument about the FTC, it's clear that the Fed is going to raise different issues and that the president may not have such broad power to remove Fed chairs.
When do you think we'll hear a ruling?
Well, Wolf, ordinarily, we get the big important rulings from the Supreme Court at the very end of their term, which usually means May and into June. However, the Supreme Court expedited the briefing and oral argument in this case, I think in recognition of the fact that the stakes here are so high. So it would not at all surprise me if we get a ruling from the Supreme Court sometime in the early part of 2026.
I'm joined by a terrific group of reporters here at the table and our legal analyst, the one and only Elliot Williams. Elliot, can you put this in perspective, what the justices are hearing right now?
Right, they're hearing words you're going to hear today, this concept of a unitary executive theory. And don't bristle at that. It's actually far simpler than you think. It's the idea that the president sits atop the executive branch and that even independent agencies ultimately serve the president. It is a theory, there it goes on the screen. It is a theory that has sort of gained steam in the last 25, 30 years, certainly through the Bush administration and on. Now,
among conservatives.
Among conservatives, yes, and particularly on the Supreme Court right now. Now, the notion is that independent agencies today like the Federal Trade Commission, which Rebecca Slaughter served on, have power that they did not have at the time of the founding of the government. They are serving in an executive function. Therefore, the president has the power to fire their members. That is merely the argument. The counter argument, and you're hearing some of this today at the Supreme Court, is that no, Congress quite clearly said that these were independent agencies meant to be independent of the president. Therefore, he ought not have power to fire their leadership at will. And the law does clearly say, passed by Congress, the law does say that they can't be fired but for malfeasance or neglect or misconduct.
I'm going to take your unitary executive, and I'm going to go even deeper.
And I thought I went too deep.
No. There is no such thing. It's inside politics. Okay, or inside the law right now. So let's just put that back up on the screen that Elliot was referring to. What is unitary executive theory? All executive power centralized in the person of the president. It's unconstitutional for Congress to limit how the president uses that executive power. Now, Roberts and Alito, as you were mentioning, they were early champions during the Reagan administration, just a few years ago. And this is based on what is known as the vesting clause of Article 2 of the Constitution. I told you we were going deeper. Okay, so what is the vesting clause, you ask? Here it is. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. So this, Elliot, is what they're sort of hanging this notion on. And now I want to make this a conversation about what it means in practical terms.
Yeah.
If the Supreme Court rules the way it sounds like they are, just by the nature of the questions and the comments from the conservative justices who very much have the majority, what will it mean in practical terms?
I think in practical terms, it means that Federal Trade Commission, Securities and Exchange Commission, as Rebecca Slaughter was mentioning, Federal Communications Commission, all sort of function differently, where the president will have the power to remove and install new leadership at will. Now, be careful what you wish for, which is what opponents have said, because once you get a Democratic president in, they can also do the same. But as of right now, the leadership of these agencies serve terms that traverse different administrations. They might be 5 years or 10 years or whatever else. That scheme may end if the Supreme Court goes as far as it could in striking this all down.
And there are also serious questions for the Federal Reserve, which is also an independent agency. Now, the Supreme Court is separately hearing arguments about the president's ability to fire a Federal Reserve governor, but that is another question that could be raised by this. Also, the civil service protections. Could the president, if the court sides with the White House, give the president expansive powers beyond just these semi-independent agencies, but to basically overrule civil service protections and put whoever he wants wherever he wants.
And let's not forget that this Supreme Court has already ruled in favor of the president, a president, not just this president, in many situations, including the fact that a president is pretty much protected from prosecution.
Right. That was actually the point that I was thinking of. I mean, this is a court that has helped expand President Trump's power and authority even before he returned to the White House. And I think we do have to remember the context of the Supreme Court. President Trump in his first term got 3 justices. So whatever the president does in his second term in terms of policy, in terms of actions abroad, his enduring legacy is going to be in Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. Now, to be clear, on other cases, they don't always rule on the side of the administration, on the side of the president. Obviously, the president has complained at times, including about Amy Coney Barrett, when they defer from what he would like them to do. But this is a court that has broadly ruled in favor of the administration at various points, even if they do have, even if this administration loses on the lower court level, which we see often, ultimately they do have a decent batting average at the Supreme Court.
I would just say, and even very specifically in the context of the firing or termination of leadership of agencies, once the Supreme Court's already signaled in this case how they're going to rule, but also I believe in the context of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, another instance of literally you're talking about the removal of the head of an independent agency. So even setting aside the questions of whether the president's handpicked or appointed justices are likely to rule for him, clearly they've ruled. Suggesting how they're going to rule.
I mean, we've seen Trump, obviously, since he came in the second term, take step after step to expand executive power. And we're seeing not just with this case, but several other key cases this term about how much power he ultimately could have. You mentioned the Federal Reserve Board, tariffs. That is going to be a monumental case that could determine Trump's entire economic policy this term. So this case could foreshadow just how far they're going to let Trump go.